Well, this is a little different. There's no white walls and a single shelf, but there's actually a background. That's because I'm home for the holidays right now. I'm in Toronto, Canada. Normally, I'm living in Vienna, I think, as most of you know, but I came back home for the holidays, and so I'm in the original room where I first started streaming back on Twitch so long ago. And yeah, it's cool to be back. It's cool to be home, but I'll be back in Vienna in a couple weeks. But there will be all the videos until then. I'm going to be filming them here. I brought my whole setup. And so that's why there's been that big delay too. I had some technical issues here. So if there's any technical issues throughout this video, please bear with me. Hopefully everything will go smoothly, but I can only do these in one take because I don't have my editing software as well. Anyways, let's talk about World War I. So we left off in 1915 and we're going to get to 1916 right now. And this is the bloodiest year of the conflict. Unfortunately, millions of men are going to lose their lives in this year through the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme, probably two of the most famous battles in World War I. And I'll talk about it later when we get to that point. But yeah, just a fascinating point in the war. And this is really one of the most important years and the turning points as well. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and also, if you don't like this angle, I might switch it up. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Because there's a giant TV in front of me here, because I don't have a monitor.
World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war.
Nope.
But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on a couple issues here. So one with the industrialized way of warfare, right? So just to very briefly sum this up, this is where a lot of the technology that we understand in modern warfare is being used in the Great War here. And so airplanes, machine guns that are firing more rounds per minute, right? There's the absolute killing machines and poison gas as well, though it wasn't as effective as was initially anticipated. And so these modern killing machines that we know very well are just taking massive amounts of casualties, whereas they wouldn't have in the previous European wars. Women in the workforce as well. This is sort of something that we think of with World War II, but this also really pushes forward the women's movement too, where in some regions of Britain, I believe it was up to 70% of all the factory workers were now women. And so this is obviously a huge push for that. I believe it's the first wave of feminism. It might have been the second wave. Anyways, either the first or second wave of feminism. This really pushes women's positions, out into the workforce and really strengthens the women's movement at this point, right? Obviously for the better, because these women were extremely needed for the production that was going on to make these weapons, which is something that had never been seen before. So yeah, just World War I is really where we sort of see the modern world that we understand sort of take place in this cataclysmic event. So yeah, just wanted to touch on a few of those points there.
All sides were preparing for a long war. The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria.
So let's talk about Bulgaria a little bit. So why did Bulgaria join the Central Powers here? So Bulgaria, at this point, they've lost now their most recent Balkan War, which was in 1912, I want to say. So they're pretty much isolated and they're surrounded by enemies, really. So obviously they lost against Serbia. They're eyeing for territory. So specifically this region here in Romania, they're trying to get, I'm so sorry, I'm not going to remember this exact piece of territorial name, but they're trying to sort of realize their ambitions. And both sides, so the Allies, or the Entente, sorry, and the Central Powers are trying to vie for Bulgaria to join the war on their side, because that is really what can tip the scales in their favor. And so when Bulgaria does join the war, this is what leads that launch into Serbia, and Serbia eventually falls. But Bulgaria, safe to say, although the successes at this point really looked like they were favoring Germany, particularly in the east, this would be one of Bulgaria's downfalls and would lead to a series of events which would eventually lead them to joining the Axis 30 years later.
At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials.
Yep.
Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire.
Neutral for now.
On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, the Russians have ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army has suffered huge losses. On the Italian front, Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defenses.
Yeah, and so they're fighting on this river line here. I think it's the Eyes. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. They'll probably get into it later, but I think that the majority of the campaign actually took place along this river line. And there was, I think it was like 10 to 12 battles, like not just like little skirmishes, but full little campaigns, if you will, that took place across this river line. And this is where Austria-Hungary, although they're not really seeing much success against the Russians, they actually are seeing a pretty good amount of success against the Italians.
While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains.
Yeah, and this is a story where this retreat is... Yeah, I don't know too much about it. I only briefly just sort of read a little synopsis of it online, but go check it out if you're interested in this period of history, in this part of the world, their history, because the retreat was just absolutely brutal into those mountains there, and lots of people perished on the way.
Now, on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro. They are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac. But 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender.
Isn't it Montenegro? Anyways.
On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land.
Wow, cool.
And help the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces. The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to the Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign.
Yes, Verdun.
On the Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense. It is the strategy of attrition. Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war, a mincing machine, where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line. In Britain,
And so, he was right? So at this point, Verdun is an extremely strategic point, and the German shelling of Verdun at this point had never been seen in human history. I think that they had fired almost 1 million shells on Verdun itself. I think the heavy guns, they had something like 1,500 or 2,000 heavy artillery just shelling Verdun constantly. And when I was in grade 10, I went on a history trip, and we actually went to the battlefield of Verdun, and the land to this day. So at that point it was 2010, but yeah, now it's 2022, obviously. And so 100 years later at this point, more than 100 years, and the land is still scarred from all the artillery fire. So you can see that the hills, they move like this, right, from the shells. And obviously a lot of it's overgrown and it's forested, and it didn't look like it would have, even 30 years ago. But you can still see that this land has been scarred by the battle that took place at Verdun. And the casualties here, I mean, I think that it was close to 700,000 casualties, which is one of the bloodiest battles in human history.
1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription.
Yep.
That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel.
So funny enough, actually, the Stahlhelm is still being used by some armies today. If I remember correctly, it's either Chile or Argentina that still uses the Stahlhelm design for their modern armies. It's a very effective design. But yeah, as he said, this is kind of a common misconception. A helmet is not to protect you against bullet wounds. If a 5.56 or a 7.62 hits you in the helmet, it's going right through. But it is really effective against protecting against shrapnel, because you would imagine that even just tree splinters, rocks, whatever, anything like this, or the metal fragments from the shell, that's what a helmet is really to protect you for.
Neutral Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany retaliates by declaring war on Portugal. On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, but it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun.
Look at that, a 5-1. That's just...
In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against British rule. It becomes known as the Easter Rising, and is put...
The Aufstand, so the what would you say, the rise up of the Sinn Féin in Ireland. Fascinating. Cool. Yeah, so this is Connell's Bridge in the city of Dublin, where the heaviest fighting took place. So this is a bit of history that I unfortunately don't really know too much about. I don't know a lot about Irish history. I don't really know that much about English history. So I'll keep my comments for now, but maybe that's a video we can get into now. Get into later. If you have a good one, let me know in the comments section below.
Put down after 6 days of street fighting.
Sykes-Picot.
In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender. General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease. Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war.
Nope.
But now, Britain and France secretly sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning after the war to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control.
So to say that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was important is possibly the understatement of the century. The Sykes-Picot Agreement for Middle Eastern history, obviously, I mean, just look at this, right? You got to think of the diversity and of the history that the Middle East has. And you can see that it's basically just a line in the sand here, just cutting between the British zones and the French zones. And so Syria would fall under French control. Iraq would fall under British control. And although, again, this is a whole series in and of itself, but yeah, the international zone, which would later become Israel, well, British Palestine, which would become Israel. And so this agreement, I mean, it's a PhD thesis in and of itself, but yeah, this was a massive mistake that arguably we're still feeling the consequences of this agreement to this day.
Unaware of this deal, Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule. In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy. That month in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war.
Yep. And so to think, right, is that within one single naval battle, they've pretty much knocked out Germany's fighting force for navy for the sea, right? And so yeah, kind of funny that one single battle just takes them out, and then they're just docked for the rest of the war.
For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west. Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launch their attack first. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners.
And so, point for that one, right? 60 miles. You compare this to the Western Front, where maybe 3, 4, maybe 10 miles are being exchanged here for trench lines, which would then be promptly captured back, if at all, right? And so for a 60-mile offensive here on the Eastern Front, and although the Eastern Front did not fall prey to the same trench warfare as the Western Front did, this is a huge advance for the Allies in this case. And it's an interesting, actually, video. I remember I watched it a couple months ago of what if the Brusilov, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, offensive actually failed, and maybe how that might have hastened, for example, the Russian Revolution or other things like this.
This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line.
Yep. And so that's what it also talked about too, is that what if they had concentrated more on the West, maybe they could have broken through in the West, etc.
At sea, British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
So I've talked about this before, but very briefly, there's a town just outside of Toronto called Kitchener, Ontario, named after Lord Kitchener. It used to be called Berlin, but then during the First World War, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, and the town's never really quite been the same since the First World War, where it was sort of anglicized and a lot of the German heritage was gotten rid of. A statue of Kaiser Wilhelm I was torn down there, and after Lord Kitchener had passed, and he died there, the town was named in his honor within actually the same month, which was June of 1916.
3 days later in the Adriatic, Italian troop ship Principe Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost.
I didn't know that.
On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes are high for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster.
Yep.
A long Allied artillery bombardment fails to knock out German defences, and waves of British infantry are cut down by machine gun fire as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed. It's the worst day in the history of the British Army.
Insanity.
But more attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months.
Yeah, and that's sort of where this perception of, I think it's in the movie 1917, they had this scene at the end where they're about to go over the top, but they're I don't remember exactly what the details of, but there's this sort of sense of that the officers, they don't care about the men here, right? They're just sending tens of thousands of them over the top to either be killed or wounded. And that's where this sort of impression of World War One, I think, really does come from, is that it probably starts within these battles, you know, the popular impression, the Somme, Verdun, other things like this.
Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies.
Yeah. So Romania joins the Allies here because they want territory. So they want this part here of Transylvania that's majority Romanian speaking. I think it's like maybe half of the population is ethnic Romanians. And I don't want to get too far into that because I'm not terribly well informed of how ethnicities work here. That's not my point. But yeah, so they're really eyeing territorial ambitions, as well as what do they have? A lot of oil. And so Germany is very happily buying their oil at this point, but Romania thinks that they can expand territorially and then capture a lot of these lands back from Hungary. So they join the Allies in thinking that the Brusilov offensive, which is just happening at this point, they think that they're going to be able to really come out on top here and sort of join late, quickly finish this off, and then make the greater Romania. That does not happen. It is a massive failure, and Bucharest is taken, I think, within a few months for the Romanians here.
Despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces.
Yep.
The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough.
The Bulgarian efforts in the First World War way outsized. You know, if you look at it from a territorial perspective, it looks like Bulgaria, it's a small little country, not that big of a, you know, maybe an impact on World War One. They had a massive impact during the war, and they fought incredibly bravely. They were extremely effective for the size of their nation, and, you know, the size of their economy and whatnot. So Bulgaria is kind of an often forgotten about player within the war, but extremely important and very, very effective as well.
On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun.
Yep.
The French army has honoured their commander, General Nivelle's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass.
Yep.
But victory comes at a terrible price. 365,000 casualties. The Germans lose almost as many.
Right, so within one battle here, you have nearly 1 million men lost, right? And obviously casualties means wounded as well. It doesn't just mean killed, but still, you have nearly 1 million men whose lives will never be the same after this one battle. And at this point, again, World War II would dwarf these numbers, unfortunately. But at this point in history, nothing has been seen like this before.
Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human history.
Yep.
For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, take command in the West.
So Falkenhayn actually went on, and he played actually a mildly important role in the history of Israel, and in that sort of area, because he was reassigned to the Romanian Corps, and then he was reassigned to the Middle East, and he was the one that actually ordered to not shell the old city of Jerusalem. And due to his orders, none of the old city of Jerusalem was destroyed at all, where it could have been shelled to the ground, losing I mean, priceless, countless amount of important artifacts for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And so, yeah, there's mild little piece in the I guess it's not really Israel; it's more British Palestine history of Jerusalem. We'll call it that.
Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme continues. Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope can break the deadlock of the trenches.
Tanks.
It is called the tank.
Yes.
But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact.
Though absolutely terrifying.
On the eastern front, Russia's Brusilov offensive comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses. Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers.
Look at that, 2.5 million casualties. Just let that sink in. I mean, it's hard when watching this video and it's just numbers on numbers on numbers. That's 2.5 million families, right? It's just the amount of human suffering is, yeah.
On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties.
10 miles, 600,000 casualties. Let that sink in.
German losses are about 450,000.
Million men for 10 miles.
The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy, because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first. Meanwhile, disaster engulfs Romania, as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, dies. He is succeeded by Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister...
And so what's interesting about that too is, as I said before, living in Vienna, Franz Josef is still really quite popular. So bloody well everywhere is his name, right? On any of the buildings in the first district, which is the historical district, there's an iced tea that's named after him, Rauch, which is one of the... It's just like an iced tea. It's kind of like a... What would you say for North Americans? It's like Nestle, right? Kind of. They just make like brisk Nestea, whatever. And they have a Franz Josef iced tea, right? And there's still Kaiserstraße and all these things that are still named after him. And it's just interesting that in comparison to Germany, where you're going to be hard pressed to find any public reference to Kaiser Wilhelm II, or even Kaiser Wilhelm I, really. You might find a couple Hindenburg monuments or anything like this, but yeah, it's just kind of a little fascinating cultural note that I found in living in Vienna, is that you'd be hard pressed to go on really any street within the first district and not find a reference to Franz Josef in some sort of way. And that's still there to this day. It hasn't been erased or anything, which in my opinion is a good thing.
Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Nivelle, who promises victory through bold, aggressive action. Amid the comings and goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come to nothing.
Yep.
Neither side is willing to make concessions.
Fantastic. Yeah, another great part here from Epic History TV, and 1916 is the bloodiest year, as I said before, but it still looks to be any side could win. With 1917, we'll see that eventually this blockade is going to be one of the ends of Germany, and we'll see also the capitulation of Russia that leads to the Russian Revolution. And I've already covered all that in the Russia Country series. Thank you all very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if there's been any technical issues. Please, please, please do. Even if you just write a comment saying, hey, all good here, I would really appreciate it. Because, yeah, all new location for now. And tomorrow I'll be filming the one for 1917, and there will be way more content than there's been in the last little bit. Thank you very much for joining me. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Till then, take care. See you guys in the next video.